So I got the new PS5 Slim in. It's not officially called PS5 Slim, but it's the reduced weight, smaller, new generation of the PlayStation 5. And I've had this for a few days. I have mixed feelings about it. When I pulled it out of the box, like right off the rip, the first thing I noticed was how much lighter it was. I've seen photos and leaks of this thing, but the weight difference was very substantial compared to the PS5 that I was originally using. Now, aside from its weight and size, the other very obvious difference is the design aesthetic. So it's got this kind of line that cuts right through the panels. So it's a quad panel system. The original PlayStation 5 was on each side, it's a single piece, right? So this is one panel, and then this is a separate panel, but on this, there's four of them. There's one on the top and the bottom on each side. And I think they derived this aesthetic from the controller. Like if you take a look at the controller real quick, this has a very obvious kind of, split panel aesthetic, right? The white segments are separated, and I think that's the same kind of look they're going for here, where the different white panels are separated with this black gap in between. Now, when it comes to, I guess, slim versions of the PlayStations, I've always been aesthetically drawn to them. Like, even though I've owned every single original PlayStation, I always buy the slim variants because they just look cooler and they're just like a little bit cleaner. This time around, I don't know, there's something about this that just doesn't appeal to me as much, and obviously this is very subjective, but I don't like the fact that it's like a two-toned material. Like the top is this glossy finish, but then the bottom is that matte finish, which is actually a little bit different from the matte finish of the previous version. But I don't know, it just looks a little bit cheaper to me. I don't love the look as much as I thought I would on a Slim. So I'm gonna pop these panels off real quick just to show you what's going on here. The top ones come off quite easily. The bottom ones, I wouldn't say they're hard, but a little bit more work involved compared to the top panels. Okay, so the first thing you'll notice actually when you remove this, this disk drive, it is a removable disk drive, and it's surprisingly easy to come. It's toolless removal. So I don't know if you can see there's like a little arrow there, but there's an arrow and it just lifts up and it hinges off. So it lifts up and it comes right off. It's super fast to remove. So the way that the disk drive connects to the motherboard, there's a connector here on the back of the disk drive that just slots right into that socket on that motherboard. And the way that you put it back in is you hinge it on the left side and it's done. No screws, nothing. And then at the top here, you can see the SSD bay. So this unscrews just like the original PS5, and you have access to the NVMe slot. So this one here is seemingly compatible with anything that would have worked on the original PS5. Now, if you'll notice, the vent styling at the top of the new PS5 is pretty plain. There's no kind of stylized exhaust venting there. If you compare this to the original PS5, this has like it's very noticeable even when the paneling is all closed up. It looks really plain to me. So this is kind of like the front view of those vents, and they don't exist on the new PS5. So my take on this is that it just doesn't look as good. I can imagine that the removal of those stylized vents can reduce the production costs of this new unit, and that's ultimately the goal of any kind of slim model, but not as nice looking. Before I open it up to show you the insides, I want to draw your attention to a couple things. The first is the size of the new PS5 is not actually that much smaller. Like when you compare them side by side, it's like a little bit smaller, but also if you had the D brand plates, like the dark plates, the size difference is even less noticeable. But I imagine D brand being D brand is gonna make some kind of crazy aesthetically pleasing shell for the new PS5 as well. The other thing, in the box, it doesn't come with the vertical stand like the original PS5. It comes with a horizontal stand, which I think sucks. It's a pair of these plastic feet that you slot into the side, or I guess like the bottom of the PlayStation 5. And when you flip it onto its side, if you can look in the hole, that's the vertical stand. Or sorry, that's the horizontal stand. Come on, man. This ain't the move. Now, you don't need to use a vertical stand. I feel like it's fairly sturdy in terms of its wobble prevention without the vertical stand. At least the disc version. I imagine the The diskless version would be slightly less stable, but I don't think you need the vertical stand if you don't want to spend that extra money. I think it's like $30 for the vertical stand. Now, in terms of the ports, it is a little different on the new PS5. The old one had one USB-A and USB-C up front. Now there's two USB-Cs on the front. There's no front-facing USB-A. And then on the back, they both had USB-As on the back, and that still hasn't changed. But the layout and the positioning of the connections are a little bit different. All right, let's open this up. Now, from my testing, my very crude testing, I don't think that the chip in the new PS5 is a new chip. The original, like old school PS5 that launched with a 7nm fabrication, then it moved over to 6nm, the Oberon Plus chip, I still think this is still using that 6nm chip because the power draw was exactly the same from all the testing that I've done so far. Okay, to get into this device, it's just a bunch of security Torx screws. Just real quick here, this is the fan that's inside the new PS5. This one is a 19 blade fan made by Foxconn. I think it's different from any of the other kind of original PS5s. I've seen a 17 blade fan and a 23 blade fan. This is 19, and I don't think those ones were made by Foxconn. I think those were like, there was like a Delta fan and NMB, I think was the other one. But yeah, Foxconn 19 blade fan on the new PS5 Slim. Okay, first things first, the power supply. It's still 370 watts. And I imagine that when you're trying to do a shrink like this to make the PS5 Slim, this is one of the things you gotta tackle first because it's like, you gotta make it small. Okay, let's get to the juice here. This is the motherboard and the heatsink. So the top heatsink comes off. Okay, the first thing you'll notice, there's a radiator and heat pipe that runs external. This is actually quite similar to, I think, the last generation of the original PS5s in the sense that there's something that runs on the outside. And then if you look on the flip side, that heat pipe runs inside and it tags the VRMs over here. And then on the back side, if you flip it, you can take a look at the updated thermal system on the new PS5. So they have a pair of radiators and a slew of heat pipes that run to the chip again. Now, I mentioned earlier that I didn't think that this was running a updated chip. And I have to stress, my way of determining that kind of conclusion was that when I ran, when I just checked the wattage pull, right? Nothing was different between this version and the 1200 series PS5 from last year. And that's very crude testing because I feel like if there was a 5nm chip draw or a 5nm process now, it is possible that the wattage is still the same, but doesn't output as much heat. But the way that I'm looking at it right now, it seems like the chip is the same. But at the same time, it also seems impossible. Like, how are they cooling this in a smaller system with like a smaller thermal design? Like, if you look at the heat sinks that we have here, these are basically the only three objects that are pulling heat off of the system, right? This radiator, this radiator, this radiator, and the heat pipes. And I guess like the shroud itself, that adds a little bit of thermal dissipation, but the blower, it's pulling off the heat. Somehow it's able to cool all of this in a smaller system. Using the same chip? I don't know. Something's not adding up. I feel like there's something I'm missing, but I'm the wrong channel to be coming to if you want to. This ain't 2D tech tips here, right? I feel like Linus, if he gets his hands on this thing, or when he gets his hands on this, he'll figure it out in a second. Okay, one area that I want to draw your attention to is this section right here. These chips handle the internal storage of the PS5. So we have the SSD controller itself, we have the storage chips, and then we have the RAM for this whole section. Now, when I heard that this was like a 1 terabyte configuration. So yeah, I forgot to mention that. The new PS5 has 1 terabyte of storage. The old ones had 825 gigabytes. And the way that they had done it before was they had 6 memory chips, like storage chips, that had a very specialized custom controller. And all of the old PS5s, it didn't matter which variation or which year you bought it, had the exact same SSD configuration and the exact same controller, that custom built controller. And Sony talked about how this controller is very important. It was integral to what the PS5 was because it was super fast, significantly faster than what the Xbox products had. But it's different now. Now, from what I can tell, there's no difference in performance. But again, my testing is so crude. The only thing I could do was just like load up a game and time it. And the few games that I tested, the load speeds were exactly the same. Very crude testing, but something tells me there's more to this story than what I'm seeing here. But at the very least, It now has less chips, so I'm assuming production cost comes down. The controller has to be different. This is a different SSD controller than the original PS5s. But as to how much it affects performance, I don't know. My guess is that it's going to be negligible, because if developers had to kind of work around this and keep this in mind, depending on which, does a person have a PS5 or the new PS5, that'd be a little bit crazy. But there you have it. That's the PS5.